Hello, and welcome to the first of 3 lectures on process capacity. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce the fundamentals of process flow analysis. Specifically, we're going to talk about process flow measures and Little's Law. We'll introduce the measures first, including inventory levels in the process, flow rates or throughput rates, and flow times. We'll talk about steady state conditions and the relationship between inventory levels, flow rates, and flow times, which is what we call Little's Law. We'll then show how we can apply Little's Law in a variety of settings to understand how these variables interrelate with one another. We'll show how Little's Law can be used to understand the flow of customers through a system, products through a system, and even money through a system. And we'll show how Little's Law can be applied at the value chain level, the process, or even the sub-process level. The point of this lecture is to get you thinking about how items flow through a process and how we can use the knowledge and relationships there to better manage those processes. So to start off, let's introduce our first measure, which is flow rate, or I'll sometimes call it throughput rate, and we'll identify this as R. Think about flow rate as capturing the number of flow units that pass a particular point in a process per unit of time. And to give you an example of this, I may look at a manufacturing plant and look at a particular point in the manufacturing plant and say, at this point, 200 assemblies pass by here per shift. I could be a business where I say I have revenues of $400,000 per quarter. Literally, that much revenue passes through the business per quarter. I could also be a clinic that serves 15 patients a day. So you see here there's an element of time here. How many flow units, whether it's dollars, material, people, whatever, flow through the process per unit of time? And that's flow rate R. The other measure we're interested in is inventory. And this represents a number of flow units present within the process boundaries. And those units can be waiting or in the process of being worked on. Good example of this is, think about when you walk into the airport and you see passengers at the baggage check-in area. Some of them are waiting, some of them are at the self-service kiosks, other people are actually working with an attendant to get their bags checked. Regardless of what they're doing, all those airline passengers are considered inventory of that sub-process. And if we have 50 of them in that process, you start to look at that and you start thinking about, how quickly am I going to go through that inventory? How long are they going to be there? Another example of inventory is I can look at a plant where I have $500,000 of work in process inventory. Some of that is just raw materials. Some of that is literally inventory that's at various stages of production. Now, if we think about the relationship between inventory and flow rates, generally speaking, businesses like to support higher flow rates with less inventory. Give you an example, go back to the airport. I would like to be able to check in 1,000 passengers an hour and have my average inventory be 10 versus check in 1,000 passengers an hour with my average inventory being 50. Why? Because there's kind of an implication that if I'm getting 1,000 passengers handled per hour and there's only 10 in inventory on average, that I must be going through that inventory faster than if I had 50 passengers sitting around. Similarly, if a manufacturing plant can generate $3 million of revenue per year with less work in process inventory, that's a good thing. The third measure we're going to talk about is time, which we're going to represent with T. And this represents the time a flow unit stays within the process boundaries. Now, all 3 of the measurements we have are important to businesses. Flow rates can include things such as net sales generated over a period of time, customers processed, etc. Inventory can be seen as an investment in the business in dollar terms. T, or time, is especially critical if we're talking about people in the process or someone's waiting on us to get the task done. Okay, so now we have all 3 of our process flow measures introduced. Let's start getting into a discussion of the relationships between them. The first thing I want to bring up is this idea of what happens as the inflow and the outflow rates change or come into balance. Think about a business process where you have an instantaneous input rate and an instantaneous output rate, defined as follows: Ri sub t on Ro sub t. If the input rate is greater than the output rate, then inventory is going to start building up in the process. And if you can imagine this inventory building up, then you can also intuitively start to see that it's going to take longer for units to get through the process. Think about an airport again, where passengers are coming into the airport quickly and they're trying to get through the baggage check-in area, but the baggage check-in area can only handle them at maybe the rate of, let's say, 200 per hour, but you have 300 per hour arriving over some 15-minute period of time. The inventory is going to start building up. The time it's going to take the customers to get through is going to start to increase. So if the input rate is greater than the output rate, the inventory builds up. Conversely, if the output rate is greater than the input rate, the inventory levels will start to come down. Going back to that baggage check-in, if they're handling 200 customers an hour and there's some inventory built up and the number of passengers coming in slows down, then they'll start bringing down those inventory levels. So inventory in the process will build up, draw down, or remain the same depending on the difference between the instantaneous input rates and the output rates. That said, most of our analysis in this course is going to deal with steady state systems. This is where, on average, the inflow and the outflow rates are matched over time. So when I talk about the average, I might talk about the inflow and outflow rates over the course of a day, over the course of a week, over the course of an hour, whatever. When inflows and outflow rates are matched, then the inventory level remains stable. So again, go back to that baggage check-in. If they can handle 200 customers an hour and on average 200 are coming in, then your inventory is going to remain stable. Now, obviously, the individuals who make up that inventory are going to change, but the inventory level is going to be roughly stable. When we have such a steady state system, we simplify the discussion by referring to the flow rate using the term R, which implies that the inflow and the outflow rates are really the same. Furthermore, when these conditions hold, we can calculate the average flow time T. And let's show you how we can do that. Suppose we have a process with a flow rate R and inventory of I. Let's assume it's in steady state. Suppose the flow rate R is 10 units per hour and the system is in steady state. How much time T will the unit spend in the process if the inventory is 5? Well, one way to look at that is we're pulling 10 units through per hour. If we're pulling 10 through per hour and the inventory is 5, then it's going to take only half an hour to get through that inventory. So I would say the time in the system is 1/2 of an hour. Alternatively, if the flow rate is 10 per hour and the inventory is 10, it's going to take 1 hour to get through that inventory. If the inventory is 40, it's going to take me 4 hours to work through that inventory. Obviously, in a business situation, lower inventories are generally a better thing. So if I can support the same flow rate with less inventory, that's a generally good thing to see. Now suppose I double the flow rate from 10 units per hour to 20 units per hour. And let's assume the system is still in steady state. How much time T will a unit spend in the process if the inventory is 5? Well, before, when the inventory was 5 and the flow rate was 10, an inventory unit would spend half an hour in the system on average. If it goes up to a flow rate of 20, then we'll burn through those 5 units of inventory in 1/4 of an hour. If the inventory is 10, we'll be able to process that in half an hour. Finally, if our flow rate is 20 units per hour and our inventory is 40 units, then it's going to take 2 hours to push out all 40 of those units. What we've been doing here is really applying something called Little's Law. Specifically, what we've been doing is figuring out what the flow time would be by taking the inventory and dividing it by the flow rate. The more common way of expressing Little's Law is I is equal to RT, but nonetheless it's the same relationship, we're just looking at it in a different way. To give you an example how we might use flow rate and flow time to calculate inventory, what if I told you that the flow rate was 20 units per hour and the units were spending 2 hours in the system? So we take the 20 per hour times 2 hours in the system, 2 hours in the system, to figure out that the inventory must therefore be 40 units. So we can calculate flow time if we know what the inventory and the flow rate are. We can calculate inventory if we know what the flow rate and the flow time are. And finally, we can calculate something called inventory turnover as a reciprocal of the flow time. Let's think about this intuitively for a second. Suppose I tell you that the flow time is half an hour. If the flow time is half an hour, then that means you're going to go through the inventory twice per hour, right? So if the flow time's half an hour, you take the reciprocal of that, and you would say your inventory turnover was 2 times per hour. Conversely, what if I told you the flow time was 4 hours? So that means it takes you 4 hours to process all the inventory. That means you would be going through a quarter of the inventory every hour. So your inventory turnover would be 1/4. Okay, so that's a little bit of the conceptual background. Let me show you how practical and useful Little's Law is in practice. Let's suppose we're looking at a fast food restaurant, a Taco Bell, and we've learned that on average 1,500 customers per day go through the restaurant. And on average there are 75 customers in a restaurant, either waiting to place the order, waiting for the order to arrive, eating, whatever. On average, how long does a customer spend at Taco Bell, and what is the average customer turnover? So one thing I might do is try to draw what the system looks like. So I draw the little process box like this. Now they tell us 1,500 customers come through there per day on average, and it's a 15-hour day. I'm going to describe that then as having a flow rate of 100 per hour. So R is equal to 100 per hour. On average, there's 75 people in the system. Easy enough. So the two questions we have are, what's the average time in the system, and what is the average customer turnover? Well, applying Little's Law, I can figure out that the time in the system is going to be the inventory of 75 customers over 100 flowing through per hour, or 0.75 hours, or that'd be 45 minutes. 0.75 hours is 45 minutes. Okay, what's the turnover then? Well, if you look at this, we go through the inventory more than once per hour. And in fact, if we look at what the turnover is, we get that by taking the reciprocal of the flow time, and that's equal to about 1.33. Another way of looking at that is we go through the inventory roughly 1.33 times per hour. Okay? Now, why am I interested in that if I'm Taco Bell? Well, one thing I'd like to do is maybe support the same flow rate with fewer people in inventory. That means if I have fewer people in inventory, by definition, they're going to have to take less time in the system, and they're probably going to be happier customers. Let's look at another example down here. The Travelers Insurance Company processes 10,000 claims per year. The average processing time is 3 weeks. Assuming there's 50 weeks in a year, what is the average number of claims in process? So again, I'm going to draw the little process flow diagram to help me think about what's going on. So what variables do I have here? They're processing 10,000 claims per year. That sounds like a flow rate. So if we have 50 weeks in a year, it's easier for me to think in terms of weeks. That's going to be 200 claims per week. And we're going to assume they're in steady state. Now the average processing time is 3 weeks. So in this case, they're telling us that T is equal to 3. So therefore, what is the average number of claims in process? Well, if they're handling 200 per week and it's taking 3 weeks on average for a claim to get through the process, inventory must be 600. Now think what's interesting about this. We don't know where those claims are in process. They could be waiting to be handled. They could be in one particular step or another step. They could be at different branch locations. Who knows? But we have an idea of what the inventory is. Now let me ask you this. If you're in charge of Travelers Insurance, do you want higher or lower inventory levels? In general, you'd like lower inventory levels here because it implies that you're processing claims more quickly. And certainly that's a customer service issue. It may also be something that the state insurance agencies look at to judge whether you are doing your job as an insurance company. So you generally want to process those claims more quickly. Let's look at a couple other examples. For instance, cash flow. Let's assume Motorola sells $300 million worth of cellular equipment per year out of a particular division. The average accounts receivable for this cellular group is $45 million, and that represents money due to them from customers. Question is then, what is the average billing to collection process cycle time? Now, average billing to collection process cycle time is a fancy way of saying how long does a dollar stay in accounts receivable. So again, we draw our box here like this. We're talking about a flow rate, in this case of dollars, 300 million per year. And we're talking about an average accounts receivable of 45 million. So if we think about the time in the system then, it's going to be 45 million divided by 300 million, which comes out to be 0.15 years. And you can multiply that by 12 if you wanted to put it into months. But in any case, if we're Motorola, we want to try to bring that inventory level down, because the longer the money is in accounts receivable, that's the less time we have it. Okay, we can also use Little's Law to evaluate statements by management. Do they make sense? Suppose a general manager at Baxter states that her inventory turns 3 times a year. So if her inventory turns 3 times a year, we know that the flow time is reciprocal of the inventory turns. So she's in effect saying that the time in the system is 1/3 of a year for her inventory. She also states that everything that Baxter buys gets processed and leaves the dock within 6 weeks. Well, that is not consistent with the statement that time is 1/3 of a year, unless you have an 18-week year. So she's off somewhere in her analysis. The statements are not consistent with one another. Okay, now that we've gotten a little bit of practice applying Little's Law, let's use it to pinpoint process performance by customer segment. In other words, in the examples we did before, we were looking at the business in aggregate. If I'm Motorola and I'm looking at $45 million in accounts receivable, I'm not analyzing where that accounts receivable is coming from in terms of slow versus fast paying customers, international versus national customers, whatever. There may be situations where we actually want to understand how performance differs by customer segment. And this is the example we're going to go through here. Let's assume we have a company called Automotive Financial Services, and they issue policies to 3 customer groups. Or they think about issuing policies, I should say, to 3 customer groups, A, B, and C. Here's how the process works. Currently, they receive about 1,000 policy applications per month. And you can see that 1,000 coming in per month. All of those applications go into an initial review. 25% of them go on to what's called Group A review. 25% go on to what's called Group B review. And then the rest are Group C, which are rejected out of hand. So if you look at the initial review, there's 200 applications in inventory there on average. In the Group A review, the average inventory is 25, and in Group B review, the average inventory is 150. Coming out of the Group A and Group B review is a decision about whether they should accept or reject the policy. So some number of Group A reviews are accepted and rejected, some number of Group B applications are accepted or rejected. But regardless, at the end of the month, on average, 1,000 units come into the process, 200 are accepted, 800 are rejected. So the first question I have, is this system in steady state? And the answer is yes. The total number of applications either accepted or rejected, we consider that total to be the flow out of the process, equals the flow into the process. So we're talking about a steady state condition, one that we can examine using Little's Law. So let's examine how performance differs across these 3 customer groups, A, B, and C. At the aggregate business level, the total inventory in the system is 375. And how did I get that? Well, if I go back to the initial diagram here, I have 200 in initial review, 25 in the Group A review, and 150 in the Group B review. So I have a total inventory of 375. I'm not worried at this point about what kind of a policy it is, whether it's going to be accepted or rejected, whatever. The inventory in the system is 375. So if the inventory is 375 and the average flow rate is 1,000 per month, then the average time in the system has to be T is equal to inventory divided by flow rate, or 0.375 months. Okay. So as I promised, though, we want to understand how performance differs across the customer segments. Let's start with Group C only. The first question I have is, how did I get this following process diagram? In this case, I have the box like I had before, but now I have a flow rate of 500 per month if I'm looking at the Group C's only. Where did I get that from? Well, if I go back to the original diagram, I said 1,000 come in per month. Out of the initial review, we determined that 50% of those are Group C. The reason we know that is 25% are Group A, 25 are Group B, so the rest of them, the remaining 50% must be Group C. So in effect, out of the 1,000 that come in every month, 500 of those are Group C. Now, how much of the inventory here represents Group C? None of this. That's all Group A review. None of this. That's all Group B review. If we look at initial review, that's got to include A, B, and C applications. And since C represents 50% of the inflow to the system, I have 1,000 flowing in per month, 500 of them being Group C, then 50% of this inventory must be C. So I go back to my slide here, and I figured out, okay, the flow rate is 500 Cs per month. The only inventory I have for the C is in the initial review. So what is the flow time for the average Group C application? It's going to be 100 divided by 500, which comes out to be 0.2 months. Now that seems faster than average, but of course it's faster than average. We reject the Group C out of hand. Go back here for a second. You see, after the initial review, we don't even bother to have a more formal review of the Group C application, so they get rejected almost out of hand. So of course their flow time is faster. Now if you look at this, which group do you think is going to have the slowest flow time? Everyone's got to go through initial review. Group A goes through a review where the inventory is 25. Group B goes through a review where the inventory is 150, and you have the same number of Group A and Group B applications coming in. And if you start thinking intuitively, you can see that the Group B applications are going to take a longer time to review. Okay, but let's move forward with that. So we did the analysis for the overall system. Average flow time was 0.375 months. We figured out for the Group C applications, the average flow time is 0.2 months. The question I might have is, what is the average time for the customers in Group A or the customers in Group B? And how can I look at all three together to get some insights about the system? So let's go ahead and do that. I've replicated the flow diagram in this slide right here. And let's look at Group A for a second. What's the inventory for Group A? Well, we got 25 up here, okay. How many of the initial review are applications from Group A? Well, it's going to be 25% of the 1,000 coming in. We could see that because Group A's represent 25% of the flow out of initial review. So 25% of 200 is going to be 50. And if my math hasn't failed me, that's going to be 75. Now, what is the flow rate for Group A? Well, if they're 25% of the 1,000 coming in, their flow rate is going to be 250. Therefore, flow time for group A, I could describe this like this, is going to be 75 divided by 250, which comes out to be 0.30 months. Okay? What about group B? And let me just draw a line here to distinguish it. Inventory for group B is going to be 150 in the group B review plus 50 from the initial review, and that's going to be 200. Flow rate's going to be again 250 per month. So therefore, the flow time for group B is going to be 200 divided by 250, which comes out to be 0.7 months. Okay. So what's the great insight from all this? Well, remember, Group A represents 25% of the workload or the flow into the system, and they have an average flow time of 0.3. Group B represents 25% of the flow through the system, and they take 0.7 months. And then you've got Group C, which represents 50% of the flow, and they take on average 0.2 months. If you take that weighted average and you can go through the calculation, you'll find out that you get a weighted average of 0.375 months. So the point is, we looked at each of the groups individually. We calculated what their flow times were like, what their inventories were like, what their individual flow rates were like. But then when we took a weighted average of their flow times, we got exactly the same answer we got when we looked at the overall system performance. So Little's Law was consistent at the aggregate level. If you add up what happens at the sub-process level and look at it at the aggregate level, it's consistent from top to bottom. If you haven't figured it out, I'm trying to work this up to more realistic, complex examples. So let's use Little's Law to examine financial flows and then discuss how we can use that kind of financial analysis to drive operational improvements. So the case we have here is MBPF Incorporated, which makes prefabricated garages. In 2011, the cost of goods sold was $175.8 million. So you might think about, what is cost of goods sold? Well, it's really a flow of dollars through the system. The key being that we're talking about costs, we're talking about some flow per period of time, in this case, over the year. So we have a flow rate of $175.8 million through manufacturing. At the end of 2011, the total inventory in the system was valued at $50.6 million. And that could include raw material, it could include work in process which has labor and machine costs incorporated into it. So we've got two of the variables. We've got flow rates and inventory. So we might ask, what does this system look like and how long will a dollar, the flow unit of interest, stay in the system? So if we draw it out, we can start thinking about the inputs over here. We've got raw materials, fabrication costs, which includes labor and other things, purchased materials, and assembly costs, all of which add up to the $175.8 million, the cost of goods sold. And we have our inventory of $50.6 million. Now what's nice about talking about this in terms of dollars then is we don't have to look at one bracket and say, oh, that one bracket's worth $3, the other one's worth $4.50. If we look at this in terms of dollar flows, we avoid comparing apples and oranges. We're talking about dollars all the way through. So if we think about what the turns are per year, I take that 50.6 million, I divided it by 175.8 million, and I get time in the system of 0.288 roughly years. That's on average, the average amount of time a dollar spends in the plant. So if I take the reciprocal of 0.288, I get about, roughly about, I'd say about 3.5 turns per year. That's not really a great number, frankly. We would like to increase those turns. How do we increase those turns? Well, the way we increase turns is by bringing the flow time down. The way we bring flow time down is by bringing inventory levels down. Now let's look at this system in more detail. Now what you can see is I've taken the raw material cost, I've taken the purchased materials cost, I've taken the assembly cost and all that, and actually show where they flow into the system. So here we see the raw materials at 50.1 million per year flowing into the raw materials inventory area, where there's 6.5 million in raw materials at the end of the year. And I have purchased materials of 40.2 million per year, and at a point in time on the balance sheet I have 8.6 million in inventory. What's going on in the fabrication area? First of all, how do I get a flow of 110.3 million per year out of the fabrication area? Well, the way I get that is I take the raw material cost of 50.1 per year and I add in the fabrication cost, which is the labor, etc., to run that area of 60.2, and that's where I get the 110.3. So my flow rate for this sub-process is 110.3 million per year. And if the inventory is 15.1 million per year, I can take the 15.1 divided by the 110.3 and figure out what the flow time is just for this sub-process right here. Similarly, if we look at the assembly area, by the time an item has flows through the assembly area, or by the time work has flowed through the assembly area, we've incurred all the expenses we're going to have. We have final assembly costs, fabrication costs, raw material, purchased materials. It's all flowed through here. And that's why the flow dollars coming out of assembly is the same as the cost of goods sold. Now what's going on here in assembly? Well, it's saying on average we have $10.6 million of goods in inventory, work in process in the assembly area, and a flow rate of 175.8 per year for that area. So again, we can figure out what the flow time is for this particular work area. All I'm trying to point out is we're starting to do a more detailed analysis of each sub-process. We can treat each of those sub-processes as its own individual box with flow rates, inventory levels, and flow times. Now, while we have already done an analysis of the overall flow time for a dollar in the system, we haven't done it at the sub-process level. So what I've done here in this slide is basically capture that information. So let's take the raw materials area. We figured out that the flow rate for raw materials was 50.1 million per year. Remember, we're in steady state. The number of dollars we spend on raw materials coming in matches that going out. If we put that on a weekly basis, it comes out to be 0.96 million. We know that the inventory is 6.5 million from the other slide, so therefore the flow time is 6.75 weeks. Okay? Now that's just flow time for the raw materials area. What you should try to do right now is maybe go to the previous slide, the one we had here, and see if you can't match your calculations to what I have on this slide, just to make sure you've had the Little's Law math beaten into your head. And once you do that, come back and we'll talk about this slide some more. Okay. Let's assume you're the plant manager and the chief financial officers come to you and say, really, I want you to improve the performance of this plant. Specifically, I want you to support the same level of activity but with lower inventory levels. Where would you start? Well, what about the assembly area? The only way I can lower inventory levels is by bringing down flow time. Because by definition, inventory is equal to R times T, and the chief financial officer is telling me I don't want you to change the flow rate. I want you to support the same level of business. So if I'm going to bring down inventory, I have to bring down flow time. Well, I look at the flow time in assembly, it's already 3.14 weeks. That's pretty low. Finished goods, it's even lower. It's at 2.9 weeks. So I might get some benefit of that in trying to bring those times down, but maybe not. On the other hand, I look in the purchase parts area. Average flow time for $1 in the purchase parts area is 11.12. That's a lot of time for stuff to stick around in inventory. So maybe by improving my purchasing performance, maybe going with suppliers who are more local, who can give me faster replenishment times or whatever, I can lower this. So if I'm trying to improve performance for the overall system, maybe I start looking in the purchase parts area first. Try to bring that time down and therefore bring its inventory down. Another thing we might look at, in addition to who has the longest flow time, is who has the most inventory in terms of dollars. And that turns out to be the fabrication area. So maybe what we say here is, flow time is relatively long at 7.12, and there's a lot of inventory dollars there. So if I can cut this in half, I can drop that inventory by half of $15.1 million. All I'm trying to point out is that if I have a financial analysis done of this plant and I understand what the turns are like, I understand what the flow times are like for $1, and I get some pressure from the finance folks, rightfully so, to improve its performance, then I can use Little's Law to examine where my pain points are and where I need to pay the most attention. Now, as a final thought here, what about finished goods? Got a fairly low flow time, and the inventory level maybe is about average. So maybe that's not the first place I want to start. I think I'm probably going to try to make improvements in fabrication and the purchase parts area first, to try to bring down the flow time in purchase parts as well as the flow time down in fabrication, especially since there's so much inventory in fabrication that bringing down the flow time can have a big impact on that. One of my goals is to go through enough examples of Little's Law, talking about inventory, flow rates, and flow times, that it becomes second nature, i.e. you become almost bored with the idea. Because if you've reached that point, you have an intuitive understanding of it. So let's look at the same company, except now we're going to do an analysis of accounts receivable. So we have to think about what is the flow rate, what is the inventory, and what is the flow time. First of all, since we're talking about accounts receivable, accounts receivable is sales dollars. That's what the unit of analysis is. So therefore, the flow rate is going to be measured in terms of net sales over some period of time. It's not going to be cost of goods sold. It's going to be net sales. So make sure you understand the difference here. And if we look at the consolidated statement for MBPF, it turns out that net sales was $250 million for the last year. Now let's suppose I look at the balance sheet and it tells us that receivables is $27.9 million. So if we draw the process flow diagram for it, the flow rate is $250 million per year, or we can turn that into weekly. We can say that's $5 million per week, assuming a 50-week year, and I'm going to do that. And the inventory is 27.9. So flow rate is equal to 250 a year, or 5 million per week. Inventory is 27.9. So what is the time $1 spends in accounts receivable? Well, it's going to be 27.9, and if I divided that by a flow rate of 5 per week, the average flow time is going to be 5.58 weeks for $1 in accounts receivable. So what that's telling me is taking a little over a month for our customers to pay us. And obviously, again, anything we can do to bring down that number while supporting the same sales level is good from a financial perspective. Okay, so to summarize, We've spent this lecture talking about basic measures of process flow, and we use Little's Law to describe the relationship between these three key measures of process flow: inventory levels, flow rates, and flow times. I showed how we can use Little's Law to evaluate operational as well as financial performance of processes. And I really want you to remember that these concepts can be applied at the value chain level, at the process level, the sub-process level, or the activity level. Furthermore, results we get at lower levels are consistent with higher levels of analysis, as we showed in the insurance company example.